You know, if you've ever got into a real rut in your life and gone through some real trouble and needed to fall back on someone to lean on, if you have, then you'll know that it's in the tough times of life that our true friends shine through. And you know, as we're following the life of David, that was true for David himself. When his son Absalom sparks a rebellion, tries to topple him from the throne by force. And at this particular time in his life, two of David's closest companions, Ahithophel and Hushai, react in opposite ways. You know, both were men of David's court, really important in the kingdom. In 1 Chronicles, we need to get some slides happening here, don't we? I think Brad told me about this. Here we are. Thanks, Toby and Ross, for my slides today. That means that if there's any typos, it's their fault. All right, so in 1 Chronicles 27, there's a whole list of the leading people in David's kingdoms, the captains, the tribal rulers, officers over his properties, and over his crops and his orchards and over his cellars and his herds. And then it describes the closer inner circle. And in that inner circle, which is only like 7 or 8 people, 2 of the ones which are mentioned are the 2 men we're considering today. And Ahithophel was the king's counsellor. And Hushai the Archite was the king's companion, his counsellor, chief advisor, and his companion, his friend. You know, these are 2 distinguished figures in the running of the kingdom. They're his companions, they're his counsellors. And Ahithophel in particular, he was an outstanding man. If he was here amongst us, we would esteem him to be very capable and a very discerning person. That's who Ahithophel was. If you have a look in the record, which is amongst what we're studying today, it says, "And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counselled in those days, was as if a man inquired at the oracle of God." Talking to Ahithophel was as good as picking up your Bible and taking advice straight off the page. Quite amazing. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. That was their assessment. It was as if God had spoken. He almost never went wrong. He was a profoundly intelligent person and wise, and an outstanding companion and advisor for David. And despite all of that, when Absalom revolts and heads down to Hebron to start off his rebellion, it's Ahithophel, it's this man, David's friend and counsellor, that he calls to join him in his rebellion. And we wonder, why would it be that someone like Absalom would think that he could call on Ahithophel, David's companion, when he goes to overthrow his father's throne? Why would he call on him? Well, if you follow his genealogy back, and I believe Uncle Tim Badge did this with you a few classes back, you'll remember that Ahithophel is none other than Bathsheba's grandfather. And if you didn't get it at the class at the time, there's a few references to jot into your margin. We find that Ahithophel is the father of Eliam, and Eliam is Bathsheba's own father. So Ahithophel is Bathsheba's grandfather. He's very close to the action, isn't he? David has taken and slept with one of his closest companions' granddaughters, a woman who was happily married, and more than that, he's murdered her devoted and her remarkable husband, Uriah, just to cover his own tracks. And so you can imagine, if you try to enter into the feeling and the spirit of Ahithophel, how he would feel about that. This, the king, is one of his closest companions. He talks to him every day. They had done so much together. It was a deep betrayal of trust, wasn't it? And one for which, on both counts, the law would condemn one to death. You could drop these quotes in your margin as well. Sorry, we're a slide behind here. Both for adultery and for murder, the law had no grounds for forgiveness, no way you could bring an offering. You would be condemned to death under the law. But this judgment of death, never comes, not for one crime or for the other, for David. And so we know from the record, God forgives and David moves on. And perhaps Ahithophel feels that David has gotten away with it. And ever since that time, years later, Ahithophel has been harbouring and holding on to these thoughts of spite and of hatred and of bitterness towards David. And so in chapter 15 and verse 12, Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counsellor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So he sends for David's counsellor from his city, even from Gilo. Notice that where he is at the time, he's not in Jerusalem, where you might expect him to be in the king's residence. He's gone back home to Gilo. I think he's moved away from David. He's gone cold and he's pulled back from the king. And so he doesn't want to live in the royal palace where you'd expect him to be. He's gone back to his home. Well, we're going to have to skip through the record a little bit today. If you come to verse 13, there came a messenger unto David saying, the heart of the men of Israel are gone after Absalom. And the amazing thing is, when we read in verse 14, that David doesn't resist. He pretty much just puts up the white flag and walks out of the city. David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. He knows we'll get no mercy at the hand of Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. So this shepherd king, he's got a sense of what he doesn't want to happen in Jerusalem. He doesn't want civil war. He doesn't want bloodshed in Jerusalem. And he wants to spare the people that are with him. And he knows that he'll get no mercy at the hand of Absalom. He knows that straight away. It's his instant response, which is scary, isn't it, for a father-son relationship. If we come over to verse 30, we see David's frame of mind as he leaves Jerusalem. Verse 30 of chapter 15, and David went up by the Mount Olivet and wept as he went up. This is the king. This is the mighty warrior, the leader of the nation, and had his head covered. And he went barefoot, the king, and all the people that was with him covered every man his head. And they went up, weeping as they went up. This is an amazing scene, isn't it? The king barefooted, weeping so deeply, deeply distressed, ashamed. What a scene it is here. And I'm sure he's sad for two main reasons. The first would be his despair at his son's revolt, his reckless revolt. Why is he going about it like this? But the second would be grief at his own sins. He knows that what's going on is a consequence of his own sins. His sin against Bathsheba and his sin against Uriah. God had forgiven David, but the consequences of those sins would go on and on for years. And David would bear the weight of that guilt day in and day out. And so it's here in verse 31 that someone lets David know that Ahithophel is amongst the conspirators. He doesn't know till now. But Ahithophel has joined them. And this would have been like a sledgehammer blow to David's heart. The seriousness of this hits him straight away. Ahithophel, he's a calculating man. He's a magnificent strategist. All his advice was almost 100% foolproof, and David knew that. He knew that's who he was dealing with. And so verse 31, when he hears that news, he goes straight to God. He knows there is no other option for him. Left to himself, he's a goner against the advice of Ahithophel. And David said, O Yahweh, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. I know it's always wise, but today I need you to turn his counsel into foolishness. Now, one thing I really love in the biblical record is the backup of the Psalms. In the narrative like this, we learn about the actions and the events and the words which are spoken. But if you come across to the Psalms, you get to know what people like David were thinking and what their feelings and emotions were. So jot in your margin there, Psalm 55, that it was written at this time, and then come across to Psalm 55 with me. It gives a really amazing picture or insight into what David's actually thinking. And it's written, like David probably wrote a little bit later, but it's written right about the time where David hears about Absalom's mutiny and heads out of Jerusalem, and also that Ahithophel has joined ranks with Absalom. All of that is in this psalm. So stick that alongside verse 31 of 2 Samuel 15. So let's pick up, we can't read all the psalm, but let's pick up verse 4 to 7. My heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. I just want out of here, away from all of this. Lo, then would I wander far off and remain in the wilderness. Selah. That's what he wanted. He just wanted to get away. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to be away from all of this, the terror of it, the shockingness of what was happening. But from a distance, David reflects as night falls and imagines what's going on in the city. So he started to flee, but he thinks back that night about what's going on in the city. And we get reflections on that in verse 9 onwards. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, which means confound their counsel, is what that means. Confound their counsel, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go about on the walls thereof. Mischief also and sorrow. Mischief also and sorrow are in the midst of it. Wickedness in the midst thereof. Deceit and guile depart not from her streets. He says, for it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was you, a man my equal, my guide and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together. We walked to the house of God in company. You know, this was a shock to David. Right up until the time of this revolt, Ahithophel had spoken nicely to David. He had come to see him and had spoken kindly to him. And so David is completely blindsided by what happens here with Ahithophel's decision. David didn't know, he hadn't realised that Ahithophel still harboured deep-seated feelings and resentment towards him. He thought the wounds had been healed, perhaps. In verse 20, he says, he, which is referring to Ahithophel, I'm sure, he has put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He thought that they are at one, that they shared shalom, that he was a brother of peace. He hath broken his covenant. And I think that probably means that, like David had made a covenant with Jonathan about being friends forever and looking after each other's family, maybe he'd made a similar covenant with Ahithophel, his close companion. I'll be your friend forever, and I'll look after your family. But now he's broken that covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. Nothing much smoother than butter, is there? Things slide on butter just so easily. The words of his mouth were smooth as butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. This is what David's seeing. He sees that all the warm words of counsel of recent years had been a cover for a bitter and brooding heart. So that's the mental picture we get. This is where David's mind is at. And if we come back to 2 Samuel 15, we'll see in God's beautiful way that David's prayer is, in this case, instantly answered, or the answer is instantly put in motion. Have a look at verse 32. And it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount, he's just prayed, where he worshipped God, which I don't think means that he did an animal sacrifice there. I think it's where they often worship God, on the top of the mount. Came to pass, when he came to the top of the mount where he worshipped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. Here a fellow feeling true, with his coat torn and soil on his head. Imagine grabbing soil and putting it on your head. How sad do you have to be to do that? And he's weeping. He's got such a deep association with David, and his heart is broken that these circumstances could be taking place. David's the light of Israel to this man. Well, David says to him, verse 33, if you pass on with me, then you'll be a burden unto me. Now, if Hushai is just a good, young, active, strong man, then I can't really see how he's going to be a burden to him if he goes on with David, hey? So I suggest from this that Hushai is an older man. He's one of his counsellors like Ahithophel. He's older, and so he's less mobile and he's less useful in terms of coming with David to go away and then to fight back against Absalom. So what I think is that David feels that with this old man, with this man, he can make better use of his mind than of his body. And so he says to him, verse 34, but if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I've been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now be also thy servant. Then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And so he asks his friend to go back into the lion's mouth and to be an agent for him, to counter the intelligent wisdom of Ahithophel. And he gives a little bit of advice about how they might communicate in verse 35. And how hast thou not there, back in Jerusalem with thee, Zadok and Abiathar the priests? Therefore it shall be that what things soever thou shalt hear out of the king's house, as you're listening, thou shalt tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Behold, they have with them 2 young sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them ye shall send unto me everything that ye can hear. So a strategy is set up for how information can get from Hushai in the court out to David out in the wilderness. What a commission this is for Hushai. See in verse 37 it says, so Hushai, David's friend, came into the city and Absalom came into Jerusalem. It's as if they come in together, hey? And how would you feel being a Hushai in this circumstance? Just imagine your mind racing as you enter the city and trek towards your house and then plan to go to the palace. You know, he really wanted to go with David, didn't he? But this friend really understands what his companion needs at the time. And so as a true friend, he overrides all his fears, all his doubts, which I'm sure he had, and returns. And this is a huge risk, isn't it? These men are fired up, they're frisky, they're ready for a rebellion and a revolt, and knocking off anyone in the way is no big deal at this time. You know how this would go. You know, he'd have to quickly dust off his hair, wash his hair, and swap over his ripped garment and make sure no one saw him. Like, why were you looking so sad, Hushai? You know, that would be a natural question, wouldn't it? So he's got to quickly change and represent himself. Well, this is David's friend Hushai. This is him, and he's repeatedly called David's friend in those references, worth jotting them down or colouring them in if you'd like to. And young people, this is the kind of friend that you and I want, isn't it? The kind of friend that you and I need to be. And I have to say I'm very fortunate and blessed to have friends exactly like this. Friends that when the chips are down, when you're in a pickle, when the job's too big or you think it's too hard, or if you're running out of time, which is not outside my purvey, and you call on them because you know they will help if they can. These are special friends. You know, you might know that me and my boys run a few cattle on my dad's property near Blackwood, so not rural, fairly much in the city. And a few times these miscreants have got out at night, and I've received phone calls from animated neighbours to advise me that they see one of our calves in their veggie patch, or in one other occasion looking through the living room window. And so in a slight panic, I've called on my friends and family to come and help me chase these guys back in. At night, on both occasions, at short notice, out of their warm homes, these friends have been there. They've had my back. A funny example, but there we are. We're running through the grass and the shrubs, up and down the hills in my neighbour's property, trying to locate these young calves in the darkness to bring them back. Good friends, true friends, when you're in a pickle. Well, if you come across, we flick through the record a little bit just to keep on subject, just with our 2 key characters tonight. Come across to chapter 16 and verse 15. It picks up with Absalom here and his entourage moving along. And Absalom and all the people of the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. Ahithophel was like the gold mine, wasn't he? He was the classic advisor, and such a score in addition to the team. It would have given Absalom's side a lot of confidence to have Ahithophel on side. And immediately Hushai fronts up and presents himself. He's got to build up Absalom's confidence in him, doesn't he? And if you read what he says as he comes into the court, you can read it, the obvious question is why does he tell so many porkies? But if you read the way he says things, I'm sure that's on his mind, and he's trying to say things in a sufficiently ambiguous way, not to lose Absalom's confidence, but also not to say anything too dishonest. God be judge. But he comes in right up front, doesn't he? In verse 16. And Hushai said unto Absalom at the end of the verse, God save the king, God save the king, which could be taken either way, couldn't it? Which king? God save the king. Who's he thinking about in his mind? And in verse 17, you see how risky this circumstance is. Immediately he's picked up on. Absalom said to Hushai, is this your kindness to your friend? Why wentest thou not with your friend? It's a bit shabby, isn't it? Turning up here, denying your friend so soon. Is that really how good friends behave? So Hushai says in verse 18, well, it's not like that. I don't see it that way. I support the popular choice of God and his people and the men of Israel, and I'll stay loyal to him. He says in verse 19, it's a natural thing to serve his son as I served him, isn't it? Isn't that a natural thing to do? Well, Absalom, having received this and seeming to accept it, allows Hushai to remain part of the team. I think he goes away for a little while now, but he's presented and he's made the contact that he needed to make. And now Absalom looks to Ahithophel for advice. Where to now, Ahithophel? What should we do now? We've got all this momentum happening. Where to now? And he leans back on this advisor. That's why he wanted him, didn't he? He's young, he's inexperienced, but he knows that if he's got Ahithophel on side, he can pretty much just do whatever he says and it'll work out right. That's what they're used to expecting with Ahithophel. Well, Ahithophel has no holding back. And his first concept is to cement a divide between the men loyal to David and the men that are going to be loyal to Absalom. To do something so outrageous, so unforgivable, so blatant that David and Absalom could seemingly never be reconciled again. And so those following one or the other would have to stick to their teams, and it would wedge that divide and force it further apart, wouldn't it? And so he suggests, and this is a despicable thing for the man that he was, that Absalom sleep with his father's concubines that were left to keep the house. And then he knows that everyone in the nation, they're going to have to decide what they think about that, aren't they? And everyone that will hear that will know that you've made yourself to be repulsive to your father. It means to stink. Your dad will think that's atrocious. That's a bad thing to do. And it'll bring division. You're either for David or Absalom now. There'd be no vacillating. And so it gives strength to one side, not to be mixed with the other side, but just for Absalom's side, just to go ahead to cement the divide this way. And did it cross your mind as you think about that reference? Does it cross your mind that Ahithophel's suggestion here is an ugly reminder of another man's actions? Another man who from the same rooftop where he slept with the women spied and took another man's wife and lay with her. This isn't a mistake by Ahithophel, is it? This is calculated. And he hasn't forgotten what David did with his granddaughter. And he sets up a mirror image of the event to wreak poetic justice on his old friend. You know, God had said that this would happen. This is a fulfillment of what God had said would happen. It would be a consequence of David's sin. And God had said, you could slip this in your margin too, behold, I'll raise up evil against thee out of your own house, and I'll take your wives before your eyes and give them unto your neighbour, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this son. So David would feel that pang as well when he found out about this. You know, it says at the end of chapter 16 there, in verse 23, and why is it here? Why does it here say the counsel of Ahithophel, which he had counselled in those days, was as if a man inquired at the oracle of God? Why does it say it here? Well, I think it's because Ahithophel had played a prominent role in the leadership of the nation. He was a key political advisor to David. And people had become used, as we said, to accepting whatever he said pretty much as gospel without questioning. He's pretty much always right. And that brings great responsibility on his shoulders, doesn't it? he would know that that was the case. He knows that whatever he suggests will happen, and he knows that what he has suggested is a vengeful and a morally corrupt plan. So as Ahithophel watches part one of his plan played out, he's planning part two of his plan, which comes in chapter 17. And he says right up front, he says, David, I'll take 12,000 men and I'll go get David tonight, straight away. I'll go with 12,000 chosen men and I'll get him tonight. Because Ahithophel knows that time is of the essence. They've already given David a fair bit of time. Their travel up to Hebron, where the rebellion started, up to Jerusalem, would have taken some time. It's 30 kilometres. It's at least a day's journey. Plus Absalom's shameful antics. David can't be given too much time to regroup, can he? And Ahithophel knows that. And he knows he's done strategies with David for wars for a long time. He knows that the quicker you act, the faster you overwhelm your enemy, the quicker you turn up on the doorstep, the scarier it is, the more chance you have of having the upper hand. And he knows that will be the case with David now. And we see how much of a personal vendetta it is in verse 2. Colour in the me's and I's from verse 1, 2 and 3. And I will come upon him while he is weary and weak-handed, and will make him afraid. And all the people that are with him shall flee. And I will smite the king only. I will smite the king only. Unbelievable. He wants to scare off David's followers and kill David himself. You know, Ahithophel's not joining Absalom because he believes Absalom's a great guy or he'll make a better king than David. That's not why he's joining Absalom. In fact, he slips up here a little bit at the end of verse 3, doesn't he? What's he say? What does he call David at the end of verse 3? In front of this man that wants to be king or is taken over as king, Absalom, he says, I will smite the king only. Because in his mind, David's actually the real king around this place. He just is. He's the one with the qualifications. He is still the king. I've got to kill that king before this one can be king. So it's sort of a slip up, isn't he? I'll kill the king only. Now there's this little expression in verse 3, and I will bring back all the people unto thee. The man whom thou seekest is as if all returned, so the people shall be at peace. A little bit confusing in the King James, so I've put up here the New English translation. And I'll bring the entire army back to you. In exchange for the life of the man you are seeking, you will get back everyone. The entire army will return unharmed. And so Ahithophel's scheme here is to, his advice centres so much around himself, but his plan will cause minimal damage, no mass carnage. And everyone straight away in verse 4, everyone thinks that's a great plan. They agree straight away. I'm sure that will work. Go get him tonight, 12,000 men. You'll be able to just excise him and the rest will come back. It's quick, it's decisive, and it brings the issue to a close very soon. Well, as an important part of this afternoon, we want to now just reflect for a while on Ahithophel's bitterness. You know, this great reversal in his friend David's life has brought to the surface the disguised and bubbling bitterness which lodges in David's companion Ahithophel. And now what's it ballooned into? Thoughts of pure hatred and literal murder. He literally wants to go and kill David himself. You know, years have passed since David's sin with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah. But as we saw in Psalm 55, war was in Ahithophel's heart. So you've got to ask, is it all right to hold on to grudges? Or in this case, isn't it reasonable in this case? I think you could build a case it was. David's committed adultery and murder in Ahithophel's own family. And you might say, God has forgiven David, but can Ahithophel be expected to forgive too? Is it reasonable? Sometimes in life you have to turn it all around and have a look at it from God's perspective, or from a practical long-term godly perspective. Can he afford to hold on to the grudges? Look where this man's life is now. bitterness always starts with hurt, someone that gets hurt, and often just not a genuine person hurting them, but they genuinely feel hurt. Then it progresses to anger, and that builds up to resentment, and then bitterness sets in. And in this case, it then leads to thoughts of murder and encouraging immorality. That's a big thing, isn't it, for one of the chief spiritual counsellors of the nation, to go from where he was through the channel of bitterness to murder and immorality. Maybe there's some fault on David's side here too. It seems he's never properly reconciled with Ahithophel, has he? Maybe David did move on too quickly. Maybe he didn't properly consider the pain that he had caused to his friend. But either way, years later, Ahithophel still feels cheated by life. He feels overloaded with emotions that he can't deal with and he can't let go of. And you can see what happens then in that situation. If you're still seeing David regularly, everything David does, everything David says is reinterpreted and misinterpreted and reinterpreted through the lens of Ahithophel's bitter grudge. He'd constantly question David's motives and interpret them in a bad light, despite all their years of deep friendship. And I want to say, young people, and it's just so true, that grudges are heavy things to bear. They're heavy things to bear. They can obsess us and cloud out all the good in life so that nothing else matters except for what the grudge is about. And it might not even be your own grudge. It's quite possible to pick up the grudge of someone else, to take on the grudge of your parents or one of your friends and become bitter yourself. There's some classic Bible imagery about bitterness. I work in horticulture and we've just come through winter, and in winter our trees are dormant. We just grow deciduous trees. So our trees are dormant. They've got no leaves. They just look like sticks. People call them dead sticks, which I get very offended about. But well before the buds start to shoot, swell, or the leaves start to shoot, the roots of the tree are already active under the soil. Out of sight, they're preparing to push the tree up for spring, ready to help the tree break out into a new season. And in Hebrews, this analogy of roots pushing the shoots and unseen activity in the roots before the pushing of the shoots is borne out in an amazing little way. It's used of those that have bitterness in their heart, which bubbles over and spreads its poison in the ecclesia and causes many people to be affected. That's how Hebrews uses it. This little passage in Hebrews, the writer says, "See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled." This is what's happened with Ahithophel, isn't it? He's had bitterness in his roots, and it's shot up and it's infected this whole group, and many are going to be defiled by this root of bitterness, something he hadn't dealt with. So this is important to think about, isn't it? Ahithophel has this root of bitterness, and it's infecting others. And here in tonight's record, Ahithophel's pride has been struck a blow, hasn't it? And even though the offence was some years ago, he's still brooding on it, and he can't reconcile. And there's a very powerful warning in this for you and for me tonight. It's so powerful. For all the knowledge that was in this wise man's head, for all the knowledge that was in his head, and you and I would love to know as much as he knew. This is where it led. It had led to hatred and to murder because he could not forgive. And David is recorded as making so many mistakes. I didn't see it like this until I studied it more recently, but David's life is not squeaky clean. Apart from the two looming mistakes of adultery and murder, David's life, he makes lots of mistakes. He honestly does. Sorry, I've just lost my place here. Alongside David, alongside David in the record is Ahithophel. And it seems like if you think about Ahithophel, sounds like till this point he'd been so upright and such a wise and considered man, remarkable in so many respects, unquestioned for what he did and the way he spoke and the way he conducted himself. We've got these two men side by side, one who'd done some outrageous sins and another that seemed so squeaky clean to those around him. And yet we know the end of the story, don't we? It's likely that Ahithophel will miss out on the kingdom because of the way his life ended. Whereas David, when he repented and confessed of his sin, God forgave him on a dime. David says, I'm sorry, and God says, you're forgiven in the very next sentence. It's amazing, isn't it? God forgave him on a dime, and we know that David will live forever. So is God wrong in this? No, it's because, young people, if the knowledge in our head, if what we learn here today, if what we learn day by day as we read the Word of God, if it doesn't affect our heart, it's of no value to God, no value at all. It doesn't matter if everyone else appreciates the knowledge that we can bring to them or might hanker after our opinions. If the knowledge in our head doesn't affect our heart, it's of no value to God. You know, it's not good enough to know that we need to forgive and not to forgive. Jesus said in Matthew 18, didn't he? He said that God will judge us like he judged that unfaithful steward who went and ground down his fellow prisoner for the last little pennies when he owed so much because he was so out of perspective. Jesus says God will bring up the same judgment on us if ye from your hearts forgive not every man his trespass. So I encourage you, young people, while you're young, learn to keep your heart soft, malleable, and let go of your grudges. Go and reconcile them and let go of them. If you love the brotherhood, if you value our unity, you can't hold on to grudges. It's so important. Pray about your feelings, pray about the person you feel offside with, and pray for yourself. Recognize that God has a plan with them as well, and leave it in God's hands to work it out and let it go. So you think maybe, well, what could Ahithophel have done? What should he have done? Are we being unreasonable on him? Well, to whom much is given, much is expected, isn't it? He's a top-ranking official. He's bright as anyone. And if David didn't realise how much hurt Ahithophel was feeling, then this great man of towering intellect should have had that tough conversation with his king and with his friend. He should have told him how much he had hurt him, how hard it was to forgive what he had done to his granddaughter and her husband, how it seemed that David had just moved on with his life as if nothing had happened. It would be a tough conversation, wouldn't it? It would be courageous to take up that conversation with your superior, with your king. But look at the brooding alternative and what it has brought him. Look where it's led in his life. He should have had that conversation, shouldn't he? Right up front, or as soon as he could cope with it, and tried to genuinely reconcile with David and stay close to the man that God loved so much. Let's come back to the story in verse 4 of chapter 17. We pick up the fact that, as we said before, that everyone thought that Ahithophel's plan was right on the money. It pleased Absalom well and all the elders of Israel. They think it's excellent advice. It rings true. It's clever and it's likely to be successful. And then for some inexplicable reason, and it's never quite like this in the Bible, is it? But for some inexplicable reason, Absalom asked for a second opinion. He asked for Hushai's advice. And you've got to ask why, don't you? Why would you ask for someone else's advice? You have the top counsellor with you, and you believe in his creds. You believe that he has the most credible answers to everything in life. Why would you ask another opinion if you had Ahithophel with you, after everyone has unanimously accepted his proposal? And I think that the real answer is that God is at work here, and he's answering David's prayer, isn't he? He's sparking something in Absalom's mind about the advice that Ahithophel gave. And perhaps, maybe, he's still David's son. He's still got a heart, Absalom. And it's possible that this razor cutting off of David, this personal vendetta, is just a bit too strong for him. I'll go in and kill the king myself, and just to knock off his dad so quick. Maybe there's something in Absalom's mind that thinks, I wonder if there is another way to do this. And so he calls for Hushai. And he tells, in verse 6, he tells Hushai what Ahithophel has said. And no doubt, without reacting, Hushai would have realised straight away that this is a good plan. This is likely to work. It's the best course of action, I'm sure, for knocking off David. And so he'd be thinking fast as, and no doubt throwing a prayer to God as well. But he's really careful. You see in verse 7, Hushai, he's wise as well as warm and godly. He said to Absalom, the counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time. Usually very good, today not so good. But it just takes the edge off that confrontation, doesn't it, between the counsel of Hushai and the counsel of Ahithophel. For said Hushai, you know your father and his men, that they be mighty men, and they be chafed in their minds. And I love the way he exaggerates this picture, and it's so colourful. There's a bear robbed of his wealth. There's none of this in Ahithophel's counsel, is there? None of this. The imagery, he's really building it up and laying it on thick. He says, they are as a bear robbed of their whelps or their cubs in the field. And your dad, he's a man of war and will not lodge with the people. He's already separated himself out from the rest of the army. He's too smart to stay with them. Behold, he's hid now in some pit or in some other place. And it'll come to pass, when some of them be overthrown at the first, that whosoever heareth it will say, there is a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. And he also that is valiant, whose heart is as the heart of a lion. You've got some of them amongst you. They will utterly melt. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and they that be with him are valiant men. So you've got to love the drama of the story, the exaggerated picture that he paints here. And so contrary to Ahithophel saying that David is weary and weak, which we know is how he was at the end of, in verse 30 of chapter 15, he's crying, he's despondent, he's so sad about things. Hushai paints him as a bear robbed of his whelps and ready to go. They're chafed in their minds, which means bitter of soul. They're mighty and they're valiant. And he says that David's already set himself apart from the company. And he suggests that if Absalom rushes in and doesn't just take a little bit more time to plan all this, then at the first confrontation, David's men will win, which isn't necessarily going to be the case, is it? But he just puts that in. He just assumes, there'll be a big scuffle and your guys will lose, David's men will win, and then everyone will think that the battle's gone against you, and it'll all fall apart. It'll be terrible. We need more time just to settle and to plan. Even the best and bravest hearts will melt because they know the calibre and the valiance of David and his men. And so instead he says in verse 11, I reckon we should gather everyone. Tell me, what's that going to do for him, gathering everyone? Why would Hushai suggest this? What do we need? What's of the essence? Time is of the essence. Ahithophel thinks that before nightfall, he can get 12,000 chosen men, no doubt the local army around Jerusalem, and go and get David straight away. How long is it going to take to get all the men from Dan to Beersheba to Jerusalem and ready to fight? At a minimum. Trumpet calls all the way up the land. How long do you reckon? Possibly weeks. Be more optimistic. Days. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. But a while, yeah? So we're giving David maybe at least 2 days to get a head start, yeah? So this plan's clever right up front. It appears that he's laying it on, they're really going to have success this way, but actually it's building in time very cleverly for David to get organised. And then he says, and you lead it yourself, because that's what kings do, isn't it? Kings lead. You lead it. You're going to have all Israel behind. Just imagine. It'll be a big thing if I walk along here and you guys all follow me. I think, that's pretty cool. I feel like the Pied Piper. But if you say to Absalom, who's so vain anyway, isn't he? You're going to learn about him tonight. He's so vain anyway. If you say to him, we're just going to get all the mighty men of the kingdom, we're going to put them in behind you, and you go and you lead them into battle. And there's no way you're going to lose. They love that, and he loves that. And he appeals to Absalom's vanity and his pride as a leader. And he says in verse 12, we're going to come and we're going to smother him and we're going to kill everyone on his side and there'll be no opposition left. Gone. Everyone that's got any sympathies for David will be gone. And then he adds this crazy detail in verse 13, and I would have thought that this overplayed the story a little bit too much, but he has this idea that he presents to all these sort of gung-ho young men that if they will run into a city, we're going to put ropes around the city, which sounds ridiculous and impossible anyway, and we're going to drag the city into the river, and there won't be one stone left. He says, we're going to do whatever it takes. We'll have enough people, won't matter, people won't be an issue, and we're just going to drown them out. And somehow this energetic and over-dramatised story captures their imagination. And so you can see these young men seeing themselves descending like the dew, no risk, total victory assured, not much risk to themselves because there's so many people, and aggressively taking even a city to its foundations. But if you come across to verse 14, you see that God is here. And despite how exaggerated we think that advice might be, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, because God is there. For Yahweh hath appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. Underline good there. It was good advice, wasn't it? In terms of military strategy, it was a winner 10-1 on Hushai's advice. And God had determined that he would defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel to the intent that Yahweh might bring evil upon Absalom. God has given Hushai the words to speak at short notice. His appeal to their manly, vengeful spirits has pumped up their tires, and so they reject the good counsel of Ahithophel. And you can imagine Hushai's relief, not external but internal. Just so thankful that it's gone through. Probably worried, like I would worry, that he'd overplayed it. Like maybe they'll see this as a bit ridiculous. Talking about dragging cities into rivers. But they don't. And you can imagine also, verse 15, how keen he is to get out of there and to tell David what was going on. And so Hushai sends a message to David to get across the Jordan as soon as he can. So the Jordan is out to the east of Jerusalem, and he says, you've got to get the other side of the water as fast as you can. And David takes that advice, and in an full overnight operation, he makes sure that everyone that's with him, which is a lot of people actually, it's hard to gauge exactly, but in the thousands, and maybe in the 4,000 or 5,000 people, maybe more, with David, and he manages in an overnight operation to get them all over to the other side of Jordan. And just having given this a little bit of thought, I actually think that as people reflected on the two lots of advice, they didn't really stick to Hushai's advice, because I think that they realised that speed is of the essence, and Absalom's people maybe reconsidered the wisdom of Hushai's delayed plan and got going before they had gathered all Israel to the fight. Because as far as the timing goes, in verse 24, if we come down to verse 24, it says, and David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom passed over Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. So at the same time that David's got to Mahanaim, which is about 2 days' journey the other side of Jordan, Absalom and his men have got to the Jordan and crossed over. So they're actually only 2 days behind when it comes to the crunch. And so I think actually they didn't wait for all of Israel to be gathered. I think some of them said, nah, maybe they did grab some, but it delayed them sufficiently, but not so long that they weren't any more than 2 days behind David when they set off after him. So then we come to the end, don't we, of Ahithophel in verse 23 of chapter 17. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his ass and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, and put his household in order, and hanged himself and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. This is a sad end to the life of a talented man, isn't it? Bitterness had finally been his downfall, because he simply could not reconcile with David. Now he'd given up all moral respect, His whole moral compass was thrown out. He suggested this immorality with Absalom, and he's revealed his own murderous intent. So in his mind, as he logically plans it out and looks at it in the future, he says there's no going back. This is going to work. My plan would have worked, but their plan is not going to work. David is going to be back, and I'm going to have to face David again. David will win, and Absalom will be defeated, and I'll have to face David as a traitor. My days of influence, they're over. And this is too much for this proud man. He cannot bear that. And so he grabs his donkey, rides home 25 k's to Gilo, and after seeing his worldly affairs in order, takes his own life and was buried with his father. It's a sad end, isn't it? And it never had to be that way. You know, in the Gospels, there's a final thing on Ahithophel. Jesus himself draws a parallel between the actions of this gifted man, his companion, and Jesus' own betrayer, who was Judas. And in John 13, verse 18, Jesus quotes, when he's in the upper room, he quotes another one of the Psalms, which you'll study this year in your notebook for Hebron. Another one of the Psalms that's an Ahithophel Psalm. And we know that because it's quoted by Jesus in John 13. He says, "Yea, mine own familiar friend," quoting out of that Psalm, which is about the Ahithophel rebellion. "My own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. My friend too, my close companion, has turned against me." And our Lord knew what it meant to be betrayed, didn't he? But in his case, he wasn't blindsided by this. He knew who his betrayer would be. He allowed his life to be taken as the will of God, even though he had done nothing wrong at all. And so this afternoon we close the door on these two characters. You don't hear anything more about either of them again. David's two close companions, Ahithophel or Hushai. Who are you going to be? Are you going to be an Ahithophel, the gifted counsellor, destroyed by unresolved resentment and bitterness in life? Or are you going to be Hushai, David's friend, digging deep to help others when they're in need, even if it may cost you great expense to yourself? And as you can see from these two men, it is a choice, isn't it? It's a choice you make. It's not about life circumstances. It's a choice you make. It's not only about life circumstances, but it's a choice you make. You know, we're all going to be hurt or offended at various times in life. And we can choose to hold those grudges close, or we can rise above them and try to find a way to reconcile. So let's be known as one who forgives easily and who moves on. Let's be known as those who are dependable and who can be counted on when the chips are down. Because you know that God has promised that if you look after your neighbour today, if you look after those who need you now, if you truly love people as Christ loved us, then in our time of need, and we're all in need of salvation, in our time of need, God will be there and provide the salvation that we so desperately need.